Ladies and gentlemen, I give you 10 acres of prime pay dirt. Bring it on.
This is unprecedented.
You're gonna need a bigger fines table.
Is he dancing?
Detector is special, Boxing Day at 9 on BBC Two and iPlayer.
Behind the glitter ball, Strictly It Takes Two is here on BBC Two later than usual tonight at 9. Now, Joe Corbyn with today's Politics Live.
It's Monday, the 12th of December, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, Labour's Zara Sultana, Alva Ray from Politico and Asa Bennett, a former advisor to Liz Truss. Today, nurses are about to go on strike, but the union reaches out.
The Health Secretary can choose negotiation over picket lines. I won't dig in if he doesn't dig in.
We'd have to take money away from patients waiting for operations to then fund additional pay.
And it's not just nurses. Rail workers, postal workers and driving examiners are all going on strike this week.
A nurse would have to work over 20,000 years in order to match the vast wealth of this Prime Minister.
He's talking about Rishi Sunak's wealth and his background, an effective political strategy.
I am determined to deliver. Thank you.
And where did it all go wrong for Liz Truss? Let's start with strikes because there are a lot of them beginning this week. Tomorrow, the RMT strike starts. Royal Mail postal workers begin 2 days of action from Wednesday. The Royal College of Nursing staff strike for the first time in their history on Thursday. And ground handling staff at Heathrow will begin a 72-hour walkout on Friday. Let's take a look at a couple of the front pages. The Guardian, Tories under fire over plans for military to act as strike breakers. And this is the headline in The Times. Similarly, drafting in troops won't prevent NHS strike chaos. Now, you heard there in the headlines, as we put it, Pat Cullen, the General Secretary of the Royal College of Nurses, wants to meet the Health Secretary. And this in The Times, rail strikes, RMT demands Rishi Sunak meeting as month of chaos begins. So my opening question to everyone is, the unions, some of them at least, are reaching out to the government. So should ministers, Tim, make a better offer in terms of pay to avert the strikes?
Well, the negotiations going on, and they're going on with the relevant pay review bodies, be it within the NHS or the train operating companies. That's the way things usually happen. There are further negotiations which need to happen. I'm sure we can come to an agreement, but there are procedures and processes to go through. Ultimately, if it does require ministers to offer beer and sandwiches or whatever is required to break any stalemate, then that may be what is required.
Well, do you not think we've reached that point, bearing in mind the list of strikes I've just read starting this week?
Well, I hope not, because these strikes are not helping anybody. And the people they're penalising most of all are lower paid people who desperately rely on public services, public transport to get to work and to do their jobs. Everyone is having a hard time, not just in this country, across the world. The last thing that is going to help anybody is a series of strikes that's going to cost people further money on top of the extra prices.
But you don't think that ministers, this is the point, ministers should intervene? They can intervene. You're right, traditionally it is between the employers and workers themselves after recommendations from pay review bodies. But the government could reject that and suggest and offer themselves to break the stalemate. You don't think we're at that point yet?
Well, Mark Harper, the new Secretary of State for Transport, has already had discussions and offered a new, fresh approach. So I think we've opened up channels of communication, but it's up to the negotiating bodies who represent, in that case, the train operating companies, to actually do negotiations with the workers and with the unions. That is what is happening, and I hope that they can come to an agreement to avoid these really, really damaging strikes.
Zara, would you like to see the government make a better pay offer to various workers to avert the strikes?
Absolutely. No worker wants to go on strike. It's a really difficult decision. And when it comes to the RMT's negotiations, which were progressing quite well, the government inserted a clause that crossed a red line for driver-only operations, and that's why they are continuing their strike action. Similarly, the RCN said that they would suspend strikes if the government would come to the negotiation board with a reasonable offer. And again...
And the reasonable offer being 5% above inflation, so probably take it to nearly 17%. I think the original offer from the unions, or the demand from the unions, was 19%. The front bench of Labour have rejected that.
Well, nurses have seen their wages slashed over the past 12 years. Nurses' wages now are 20% less than what they were in 2010 in real terms. And these are the people that keep our NHS running. We clap for them, Tim clapped for them, I'm sure everyone on this panel clapped for them during the course of the pandemic. And now they're saying that they need wages to address the cost of living, and they're going to food banks. I hear it in my constituency all the time, and it's time that we actually pay them what they deserve.
Should the government, Alva, make a better offer at this point to avert the strikes?
I suppose not really for me from Politico to be commenting on that, but I think sort of the politics of it is very interesting because nurses, maybe more so than any group of workers, I think are sort of, they strike a particularly emotive chord, I think, for people. It's not something I hear people acknowledging straight up when they talk about it, but I just think when you hear about nurses striking, probably everyone on this panel, most people watching, you know, think of a nurse and, you know, they know that in many cases, they've been there for some of the most difficult moments of their lives. You know, they've been there for difficult news, for, you know, the loss of someone. I think it means that for the Conservative government, it's very difficult to use some of the rhetoric that we often see deployed around people striking. And I think it just means that we're in a much more difficult situation. It means that then the whole tone around all of these strikes is put under starker relief. And then also with Pat Cullen, you know, making the case that, you know, nurses are I think, in the UK, the least well paid in Europe. And I think when everyone thinks about nurses in particular in that way, it's... I think it's just very difficult.
Do you agree with that, Asa? Do you think the government's making a miscalculation, listening to what Tim was saying in terms of whose side the public will be on, that perhaps they're relying on the fact that voters might actually, in the end, not support some of these strikes, partly for the reasons that Alva has said, but also because of the inconvenience that will be brought upon them over Christmas?
So, look, when you see the prices are going up in shops after COVID and Putin's war, it's understandable there'll be unions who'll be wanting to fight for better deals for their workers. But then when you look at the numbers, effectively 17% pay rises being demanded. That is more than you're getting often in the private sector. And the government has made clear that to try and effectively grant all these checks to people would, add lots of cost on families up and down the country, particularly when they're not all going to get the same sort of deals. So this is why effectively they have to have a sort of carrot and stick approach, trying to engage in the negotiations, but also being ready with sort of fallback options. So take the transport unions. There's obviously a lot of chatter about minimum service level legislation.
Well, it hasn't appeared, has it?
I think it's been introduced, but it needs to be sort of pushed through the next few stages. And so what Rishi Sunak seems to have done is he's tried to take the reasonable approach at first, saying, just please listen and let's compromise. And then now he's dusting off and he's taking the gloves off.
Will they put a better offer on the table, do you think, the government?
I'm not one to preempt that.
Let's have a look at this in the Daily Telegraph. Labour vows war on hostile health unions. You may have seen over the weekend, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, says NHS must reform or die as country braces for wave of strikes. What did you think of that interview that Wes Streeting gave over the BMA, particularly, Zara?
Well, it won't surprise anyone that me and Wes come from different wings of the party and that I don't agree with what Wes is saying here. For me, the Labour Party's trade union link is of utmost importance. And in this moment in time, trade unions are that fight against the government and the cost of living crisis. They're fighting for their members. Unions aren't these, weird bodies that are just acting unilaterally. They are democratic institutions and they're acting in the interests of their members.
What do you think about the reform or die in terms of the NHS?
It's not the language I would use. I think the NHS needs serious investment. Over the past 12 years, it has been pushed beyond our imagination, it's on its knees. I know of constituents who have waited long hours in A&E. Ambulance waiting times are a real concern as well. Mental health waiting lists. So we need serious investment here and to look at the issues, but I don't think that language helps.
What about, though, Wes Streeting actually calling on the BMA, picking a fight, if you like, with the BMA, as one of your former colleagues, Sam Tarry, has said? Is he wrong to do that?
In this moment in time, the fight is clear. It's in support of workers against inflation that is sky high, mortgages that have increased, fuel prices, food prices, and that's where we need to target our focus.
What do you make of the strategy here by Wes Streeting, taking a tough line here with the BMA?
Yeah, I think it's just very interesting. I mean, I'm also just very fascinated as someone who loves following Labour politics, and by the, as Zara put it, you know, the big differences between her and Wes, because you know you can see the problem there that this is the historical, you know, political wing of organised Labour in this country. But I think that the strategy is maybe to put a bit of distance there. That, you know, we've heard from Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, that whole front bench, time and time again, that they want to be seen as a government in waiting. So they won't necessarily be on the union side in these sorts of discussions. They want to be seen as the arbiters, sort of working in between the employers and the union. So I think that Wes Streeting seems quite comfortable leaning into that. I would say that, you know, if anything, the you know, Labour's quite preoccupied with hammering home, not Zara or people on the left of the party, but I think in general they just want to be seen as a party ready for government.
But isn't it also that Wes will know the BMA are going to be voting on, I think, junior doctor strikes in January, and so it perhaps helps to have a really loud and large bust-up with the BMA on this, because they know that if the Tories can pigeonhole Labour as just the union's puppets, then that's rather sort of poisonous in the eyes of the voters. Then they think that they're not really on the side of, you know, working people, the general public at large. They're on the side of the strikers, not the strivers, etc. So I think it's rather savvy positioning.
And I also think that Wes Streeting has a really I mean, it sounds a bit cynical to say this, but has a real advantage talking about this because of his recent health experiences with the NHS. So, you know,
he was waiting for cancer, wasn't he? Follow-up.
Yeah, so he's been treated for cancer and has spoken about his gratitude to all the people who helped him. But now he's very well placed to say, but I haven't had my follow-up appointments. And so, you know, as a Shadow Health Secretary, he's very able to make these arguments.
Yes, I mean, he's on the side of the patients, Tim.
As we all need to be. And I have to say, I do have a criticism of the BMA. I think that many doctors in particular have been badly led. They've become very politicised, some of these unions, and certainly holding out now for big pay increases for well-paid senior doctors as well will not go down well with the public.
What about the issue of recruitment? Because there are a shortage, both of nurses and doctors.
And it's interesting, just about every problem within the National Health Service, we've had problems in the National Health Service for years and years and years. It's a fantastic service, but always needs more money, and we always need it to do more. You can trace all those problems back usually to failure to recruit sufficient professionals within the health service, and we're seeing the consequences of that again now, as we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Everyone, I think, wants to see the nurses paid better. Above all of those people holding out, well, I think the nurses gain the most sympathy.
Well, on that then, perhaps you won't be very sympathetic to this that has obviously come out of the briefing to journalists from Number 10. John Stevens, political editor of The Mirror. Health Secretary Steve Barclay will not accept the union's offer to call off NHS strikes and sit down for talks on pay, says Number 10. Is that wrong?
Well, as I said earlier, it's up to the NHS to be negotiating with the nurses over this. We want to see them have a good pay rise. They got well above average of public services last year in their pay rise. Every nurse is getting extra this year, but 19.5%, I'm afraid, is just not realistic.
Right, well, that may be the case, but it is the government's decision in the end in terms of pay and pay rises. The Daily Telegraph, we're going to move on and talk about this story. Jeremy Hunt faces Tory rebellion over £7 billion of government spending on woke projects. MPs write to Chancellor to demand that ministers cut spending on equality and diversity measures in order to reduce taxes. You're one of those who signed the letter to the Chancellor, Tim. Why?
At a time when we desperately need all the public expenditure to be spent on things that really make a difference to people's lives, be it in the NHS, be it on transport, be it on teachers, and at a time when taxes are historically at a very high level, we are spending £427 million on equality, diversity and inclusiveness staff, some of whom I'm sure are doing a good job. But the rest of them, are they really essential? Are they really a priority when we need more nurses, more teachers, more train drivers or whatever? That's what we are questioning. And is the taxpayer getting value for money? And if you look at some of the schemes that we are paying for in the police, in the fire service, in the Arts Council, £500 million spent by HS2.
Do you not want to encourage diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I do, but I don't want to spend £427 million of the taxpayers' money, 10,000 people across public services involved in that.
All right.
Over a million days.
Well, we'll come on to some of the detail, but I hear you. What do you say in response?
It just looks like classic Tory divide and conquer. Let's not deal with the fact that racism and discrimination do exist in the public sector as well as the rest of society, and especially with the recent report from the London Fire Brigade, Charing Cross Met Police investigation, where there are serious issues. We see the Conservatives direct their focus on strategies to address racism and discrimination instead of issues like the fact that they gave £200 million of public money to who was then a Conservative peer, Michelle Mone, or the Chancellor at the time. I'm just saying, let's focus on the real issues.
OK, well, let's focus on the real issue. You've mentioned the fire service.
And racism.
1,500...
This sort of money would help that. I was talking, and if I could just finish that point, what I would say is that when you have a Chancellor who has given billions of pounds in tax cuts to bankers, it's interesting that in this moment of time around an economic crisis, that this is where Tory MPs are directing their energy.
Tim?
OK, so we heard about London Fire Service.
Yes.
1,500 days of training on equality and inclusiveness for London Fire Service over the last few years. And Zara's quite rightly pointed out serious problems with the fire service. So that was a really good use of money, was it? So we're spending this money on questionable priorities, and it's not even producing the goods. Of course, we need to drive
it altogether.
No, I've not said that. You haven't listened, because what I said is there are good uses of this money. We absolutely need to make sure we are driving out racism and inequalities, absolutely. Spending this amount of money on this amount of people across so many public services and it's not producing the results is not the best use of taxpayers' money, and I want that money to spend on nurses and doctors,
when we talk about good use
and
of
all the other
taxpayers'
public
money,
services.
When billions of pounds over the course of the pandemic went to dodgy COVID contracts that were given to Tory friends and peers and so forth. So I just think it's interesting.
Well, that's another issue all along. And of course, right at the beginning of the pandemic, the Labour Party and everybody else quite rightly was saying we desperately need to get more PPE when there was a world race on to get PPE from across the globe, and the government did that. Now, in retrospect, of course, there's all these huge criticisms going on about what happened. Some of them need to be looked at in more detail. They will be as part of the pandemic inquiry. But now, of course, Captain Hindsight and his party that Keir Starmer's been throwing around all these criticisms that they were saying exactly the reverse 2.5 years ago.
Are you sure about the figures, by the way? I mean, the figures that have been quoted, £7 billion worth of waste. I mean, are these issues that actually your constituents might worry about if grants to charities were taken away and withdrawn? I mean, it's difficult to see how exactly you've come to £7 billion, as we've had a brief look this morning.
Well, I've only concentrated on this is a very big report. And a number of MPs, including me, wrote to the Chancellor about the spending that goes on EDI positions, which is £427 million. There's additional money on training. Then there's all sorts of others around charities, which we're not talking about here. It's a separate matter.
What do you make of this discussion and a row over this?
Asa? It was definitely very interesting to read the report, particularly when there's lots of loose ends I'm sure people want to chew over, because they talk about things like government departments handing out money to charities who effectively are slagging off government policy, and then they argue that's therefore is right to sort of withdraw that funds. I'm sure Zara and others would then say, hang on, but does the government, should they be suppressing free speech among the charity sector? Those are interesting sort of sub-arguments. But what really stuck out for me, as someone who worked with the Government Equalities Office in my time, it was that they talk about things like unconscious bias training. And we know from the evidence that this sort of diversity training, whatever you want to call it, the Cabinet Office make clear, academics make clear, unconscious bias training is useless. If anything, it also has a risk of backfiring.
Useless?
Well, there is no evidence it works. And if anything, it can backfire by actually inflaming tensions among sort of staff. And so that's, for example, something I imagine that could be right for the chopping block. Liz Truss, as Equality Minister, made that clear. The Cabinet Office made that clear as well, and so trying to phase it out. The other point I would say, disclaimer, of course, is that we'd all want the government to be able to draw on the biggest, broadest pool of talent and for people to feel safe. But at the same time, we have to balance that with making sure everyone, there are outcomes being delivered. Money.
So I just feel like in all of this discussion, and I haven't had the chance to read the report, but reading all of the media coverage of it, I haven't read a line about what these people actually do. And so I actually just feel like we're not very well placed to have the argument. I mean, I actually just don't know whether to be making the case for the people in these sorts of roles or not. I think everyone has their instinctive, quite visceral reaction that we saw from the MPs on the panel. But actually, I think it's very difficult to criticise these people before knowing exactly, apart from the example of
well, that's a specific example,
training.
isn't it?
But I think in general, I would just genuinely like to know what kind of work is involved before we decide whether to scrap it.
Should we ask Jay, because the BBC employ 15 of these at well over £1 million a year. What benefit have they been to you?
Oh, huge benefit, I'm sure. Zara,
what
do you think?
How?
Well, I mean, I personally haven't had the pleasure so far, but to say that we wouldn't need any diversity and inclusion or people working in that.
Why haven't you been re-educated?
Well, this isn't about interviewing me about the BBC in terms of diversity and inclusion, but it is quite interesting to hear both the MPs taking a very firm stance. Is it culture wars rather than the issue itself?
Exactly. I think it's stoking into culture wars, and we see that when the government kind of whip up the rhetoric around migrants. We see it when they whip up the rhetoric around very vulnerable communities like the trans community. And hence, again, that's why I think it's really important to focus on the real issues, which is where billions of pounds has been essentially wasted and handed to people who have sent it to offshore tax havens. And there's very little accountability on those issues by this Conservative government.
I mean, I suppose, Tim, as you look at the list of signatories, including yours, they are mainly, forgive me for pointing it out, white men who may not have benefited directly or know what diversity and inclusion could do.
I haven't actually seen the full list, but
I've got them
heard
here.
A lot of support from my colleagues who don't fit into that stereotype. But I mean, the Arts Council has got a programme in, I think it's called Unlearning Whiteness. We've got the Criminal Prosecution Service is spending a fortune on. The Warwickshire County Council has spent a fortune on African drumming sessions. Well, there is a serious problem we need to address. Spending this amount of money is not the best way of addressing it, and the evidence is not there. This isn't about culture wars. It's about how, particularly at this time when money is tight, we can best be spending taxpayers' money on the services we desperately need for all of our constituents.
The organisations you mentioned, of course, aren't here to defend themselves, although the Arts Council has questioned the amount of money that's cited in the report and also questioned the language that has been used that you quoted from. We're going, yes, very briefly.
I mean, it is definitely culture wars. Whatever you think about it, either way, definitely this is terrain that lots of Conservative MPs like Tim feel a bit more comfortable on. Like the Conservatives aren't polling terribly well at the moment, but on this, I think that you would say yourself, you feel like you take the common sense approach, and that it's more comfortable for you to be making these arguments than talking about some of the trickier issues. I think, and it's been quite successful that we're able to
saving money for essential public services, which we've all agreed we desperately need, whether that means pay rises for the nurses, or it means train drivers, or free school meals, or whatever. That money should be going to where it's best needed.
There are different ways to get the money as well.
It sounds like a big number, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that much money. It's just because all these numbers sound big when you're talking about
27 million. It's quite a big number.
It's just easy if you're talking about a whole country and all these different in organisations for that number to sound massive. But you could do that for anything under the sun and make it sound big if you're talking in a sort of national context.
Come up some really good uses of £427 million, and they wouldn't mind missing out on having an EDI trainer.
Well, we heard in the headlines the backbench Labour MP, your colleague Zara Richard Bergen, criticising the wealth of the Prime Minister, while the Labour front bench are pursuing policies such as scrapping VAT for private schools and abolishing non-dom tax status. We're joined by Joe Twyman from Delta Poll. He can tell us how this strategy is playing out with the public. What is Labour's strategy, Joe?
Well, it seems to me that the Labour's focus is on stories that it wants to tell around equality and fairness, and it hopes to do that through these kind of policy statements. And so it's focusing on policies that really affect a very small in many cases, very wealthy proportion of the population. For instance, the private schools policy is something that will affect probably fewer than 2% of the entire population, and they will be, not always, but certainly better off. And at the same time, it wants to push this idea of fairness and fiscal responsibility. So it's looking for policies that affect a small number of people, ideally, and that bring in some money while also telling this story in their favour.
Is it working in terms of being a vote winner?
Well, individually, these policies do poll well. If we take the case of VAT for private schools, this is something that has proved popular. A plurality of the population believes that it is the right way to go, and indeed a sizable chunk also believes that some form of reform, whether it's keeping tax status if schools help state pupils more. This is all the kind of thing that is popular. Only around 1 in 10 people actually believes the status quo around private schools should be maintained, and even among Conservative voters, that figure is only 1 in 5. So yes, it is popular, and if you look at the broad picture, Labour is maintaining a strong lead ahead of the Conservatives. Now, of course, there's a lot going on there, and a lot of that will be the fact that the Conservatives are not doing well and Labour are benefiting from that. But certainly at the moment, these policies do appear to be resonating.
So people say that they care more about the sort of tax status or the charitable status given to private schools than they do about bigger issues like the NHS.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you test the individual policies, they perform well. But there's a huge world of difference between that and actually relative performance against other policies. There's no doubt that at the moment the cost of living is very much the only game in town for many people, and with more than 75% of people saying it's among the most important issues facing the country. And so that's important. But as is the economy, taxation, the NHS, education, all of these are immigration as well. All of these are important subjects, and very few people are saying, I'm going to vote based on the taxation policy of the respective parties when it comes to private schools.
All right.
But instead, those policies over time can help to inform, as I say, a story about the party, whether it's one of fairness and competence or ineffectiveness and failure, that will help drive people's vote in one way or another.
Zara, are these policies designed to single out the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, for his wealth and his background?
These policies highlight how society is rigged in the interests of the powerful and the wealthiest. Why do we have tax breaks that the wealthiest in our society can benefit from and pay lower taxes than the rest of us? That's the non-dom status. Why do we have a policy in place that allows wealthy families to get tax breaks to send their kids to elite private schools? That's the tax exemption for private schools. And I think people are seeing just how grossly unfair this is. And the Prime Minister himself embodies both of these policies very well. His family benefited from the non-dom status. He went to a private school and made a donation of £100,000 to that private school.
So it is about singling him out, so as you say, the embodiment.
He's the wealthiest Prime Minister to ever set foot in the chamber, and he has pushed through policies that represent that background as well and those interests. So if he kept the £20 universal credit uplift, you could say, he's put policies that help the most poorest in our society, the most vulnerable, but he hasn't. He's scrapped the universal credit uplift. Free school meals is not a policy that they have extended to all primary school kids, which is something that I'm personally backing. There are all of these things that the Conservatives could do, led by the Prime Minister, and they don't.
I mean, how does the government and the party square telling the public that there isn't enough money for a pay rise of 17 to 19% for nurses, and yet the sorts of policies that Labour is campaigning on, getting rid of the charitable status of private schools and non-dom status, that actually they're still in favour of those?
It's very divisive politics, this, and actually the figures don't add up. There are two reasons you have taxes. The first reason is to raise money for the public good to spend on public services. That's why I support taxation. The second reason, which is what Zara, I'm afraid, the Labour Party increasingly are leaping on, is to penalise those people who have more money. Now, you can kill the golden goose. So if we actually look at the non-dom status, it was actually made official by the Labour Party and the Labour government back in 2008, where they recognised the status and charged people £30,000 a year to retain that that status. So their overseas income, not that brought to the UK, wouldn't be taxed. We then actually increased that threshold to 50,000 and then to 90,000. Now, those non-dom people in this country now are contributing through income tax, through CGT, the capital gains tax, and through national insurance, £8 billion a year. So you have a choice. Either you can completely penalise them so that many of them would move away from the UK because they're very mobile and that £8 billion disappears, or you can recognise that people have a certain status. We want to encourage entrepreneurs. People are going to pay tax and put money into the economy over here, and public services can benefit from that.
Zara?
What would end up happening is we would have less money for public services because we frighten them all away and they'll go to somebody else and another country's economy will benefit from them. That is crazy.
Zara?
I think when we have a situation where people can benefit from lower taxes that the ordinary person can't, I think that shows that we have a grossly unfair system that is benefiting very wealthy people. And I think when you've got a cost of living crisis and we're talking about where money could be better spent, we could raise 3.2 billion from getting rid of the non-dom status. We could raise 1.7 billion by getting rid of the VAT exemption on private schools. All of that money can go to the NHS.
Yeah, fine. I mean, you can disagree in terms of the figures that might be raised or might not be raised, but is the strategy actually working? We've just heard from Joe Twyman. It's popular with people. It may not raise that much money. It may not be the biggest issue, but it is popular.
Yeah, it's good politics, but bad policy. And so obviously not going to go into the policies and why there's
Labour are, 20 points ahead.
No, of course. But the thing is, let's go back to the fundamentals of this as on polling. I think it's been said that the voters will decide on competence, on the core bread and butter issues. We know from previous elections, so let's say Jeremy Corbyn, when he put his platform to the people, when voters were looking at it in a blind survey, in other words, not having any idea who was proposing, renationalising the railways and all the rest of it, they would say, brilliant, this all looks great. They tended to like the policies. When they realised you turned over the card and it was Jeremy Corbyn who would be Prime Minister enacting all this stuff, they thought twice. And so this is why, at the end of the day, you're going to be thinking about the economy, cost of living, and I wouldn't say so much this at the election day.
So actually, hilariously, on the tax exemption for private schools, that wasn't some sort of Labour strategy as far as my understanding goes. That was actually probably number 10 that thought that was a wedge issue. The Daily Mail ran front pages on that.
Well, Michael Gove was in favour of it.
Michael Gove was in favour of it a few years ago, but I think it did genuinely at first catch Labour by surprise. And then they looked at the polling. I think a plurality of the public do actually support it as a policy. And then they decided to lean into it, and Rishi Sunak, I think, found himself on the back foot on the issue, Prime Minister's questions. But that's really not some sort of big, genius Labour strategy. I think the wider stuff is, but that was actually just a policy that was in the manifesto, and I think that the Daily Mail thought they could kind of cause a bit of a ruckus around. It didn't really work at all.
Right. I mean, you recently featured in a video, Zara, in which you said Rishi Sunak was totally unfit to be Prime Minister because he went to private school and Oxford University and was a banker before becoming a politician. Why are those things? Why do those things make you unfit to be Prime Minister?
It makes him completely out of touch, and we see that in the policies that he has supported as an MP, as Chancellor, and now as Prime Minister. And it's no surprise that the Conservative government is not going to push forward on these policies when the Cabinet itself is overwhelmingly privately educated and the party is funded by 1/3 of billionaires in the country. It makes it doesn't surprise anyone that they're not going to go forward on these.
But being out of touch is one thing. Being unfit is quite another. Does it actually disqualify someone like Rishi Sunak?
Rishi Sunak does not have any experience of what it is to, struggle to pay the bills, experience hardship like what we're seeing in our constituency. Wealth around 700 million is extreme wealth. It's not, something that you can just kind of accumulate over a number of years. It is extreme. And what we're seeing through this government is that out of touch behaviour that when you have that kind of wealth, what that means.
I mean, unfairness is at the heart of this, isn't it? And that's the problem for the Conservatives. They're behind in the polls. These are issues that are working well with the public, and the out-of-touch label is beginning to stick.
Yeah, but Zara calling a lot of quite talented people unfit simply because they don't fit into her mould is hugely divisive and a huge writing off of a lot of talent. We need to have more fairness in society, absolutely. So in education, one way you do that is not to try and bring down those educational establishments that are achieving well, it's to take everybody up. Now, that's why, in the last years of Conservative government, the PISA ratings for UK schools on literacy and numeracy have gone up 9 points, unprecedented. We've now got over 90% of schools in this country are rated good or excellent. We need schools to be doing even better so that people will look at local schools and say, actually, my local comprehensive school, the sort that I went to or whatever, or academy, whatever it may be, actually doing a really good job. I don't think I need, for whatever reason, to send my child to that private school. That's what we believe in levelling up. But this constant class war, harking back to the class war we've had in the 70s and 80s, that if somebody's doing well, then if they've got money or they just happen to have a background, their parents happen to send them to a school, then actually they don't deserve it and we need to drag them down.
Well, Zara?
It's how policy is maintaining that inequality we see in society. That is exactly what this Conservative government's done. We have a huge squeeze on wages, the greatest since the Napoleonic era. Wages in real terms have fallen, and people are seeing that the status quo simply isn't working for them. And then you have these policies that entrench that inequality, and it's simply unfair. And I don't think it's tenable to continue pursuing that.
So the last Labour government condemned hundreds of thousands of our school children simply because they had no aspiration for them to achieve poor levels of qualifications in a whole load of areas.
That's quite a sweeping statement, isn't it?
It's true, because we had GCSE equivalents in all sorts of things that made people, frankly, unemployable. What we've got back to is making sure everyone has got the basic essentials and they can absolutely achieve what their talents will allow them to achieve, because we're giving everybody the opportunity. That's what the Academies programme has done. That's what EBACS have done. It is equal opportunity.
When you've got private schools in the system that are essentially...
But then should private schools be abolished? Should Labour go further?
Do you want to abolish them?
I personally believe in getting rid of private schools.
So that will cost £4.4 billion of all those kids then having to go to state
Let's return to the political strategy.
£4.4 billion. You are now losing, and you're going to gain £1.7 billion by this VAT. Again, a net loss. Your figures don't add up. It's fantasy politics. That's the problem.
Joe, just listening to this discussion, if it is a class war that Labour has launched, can they win it?
Well, I think their victory or otherwise will depend not just on class war but on more broad questions of fairness and competence, as was said. But both parties at this stage in the electoral cycle are doing this with their policies, attempting to send messages about the type of party they are, whether it's the Conservatives with what was mentioned previously about spending on health, on diversity and inclusion, appealing to a certain proportion of Conservative voters, or whether it's Labour with its focus on the rich and an emphasis on private schools. It's essentially they're trying to do the same thing, to tell stories to their supporters. But individual policies are best thought of like the items on a set menu at a restaurant. You might like some bits, you might like all of it, but ultimately, if you can't pick and choose, you're going to look at the restaurant, and if the restaurant doesn't look good and if the chef looks a bit iffy, you'll probably eat elsewhere.
You've made me very hungry. Joe, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's just take a look at this headline from this weekend's Financial Times. It says, the inside story of Liz Truss's, that's not it, the inside story of Liz Truss's, that's better, disastrous 44 days in office. And there's also this from yesterday's Sunday Times saying that the former Prime Minister's main focus is on continuing to fight for her libertarian ideas, and according to a close colleague of hers, she will fight for her reputation and ideas. Liz still thinks Trussonomics was right, and she's selling her message in America. You were her former advisor and speech writer during her brief premiership. Do you have any regrets?
Look, I feel it's an absolute tragedy what happened. I've worked with Liz for 2 years.
For whom?
For the nation, the economy, the party, for her. I could go on, but I will stop there. Because the thing is, just to unpack this a bit further, because, working with her since trade, I knew she was someone who very much knew what she wanted to do, had very clear ideas, had a real relentless drive to, get things done. That's what made her an excellent cabinet minister. She always wanted to, sort of crack on and sort of push the envelope. But clearly, as Prime Minister then, she charged ahead without bringing her party and the markets with her in that sense. And so and actually one thing I'd quickly add into the mix is, I remember very well, what in the few days after the mini budget, that basically on paper it really could have worked. It could have actually had this mission accomplished, because the independent National Institute of Economic and Social Research estimated at the time that the measures that were being taken, the tax cuts, the supply side reforms, could have put us on track for 2% growth next year, which we can all agree growing economy is much better than one slipping into recession.
So where did it go wrong?
So, I think simply that, well, maybe as a mixed blessing this, I wasn't in the room for the mini-budget discussions, but then with my reading of it, I think that she clearly was impatient, too impatient in that sense to try and deliver, because we must remember in the summer with everything, energy crisis, economic crisis, an in-trade from hell, that she would then not want to sort of sit dithering, delaying, discussing. She'd want just to sort of crack on. And so obviously she came in there too far and too fast.
Yeah, but was it just that, a question of sort of timing and tactics, as Kwasi Kwarteng, that then Chancellor said, or was it just bad ideology?
Well, Kwasi said he got overexcited and, got carried away, I believe. So, and I think that you can imagine there was that sort of giddiness, that sort of impetuousness of trying to just charge on. He went on the media, I think Laura Kuenssberg's show, and said more tax cuts to come, with that flourish during the mini-budget, saying it's not just getting, not just doing this, but abolishing 45p top tax rate. But I think in terms of the ideas, we must also remember that, the only thing that survived after Jeremy Hunt came in and gutted the Trussonomics agenda was rolling back the rise in national insurance. So in some ways, real Trussonomics has not been tried yet.
And would you like to see Trussonomics being tried, Tim?
Well, I didn't vote for her.
I know.
And there were some good things in what she said she wanted to do, and there were some good aspects of that budget. But the timing and the presentation were really bad, and she didn't roll the pitch. And the trouble is, you cannot come up with a radical set of economic reforms, particularly at the current time when the world economy is in a very fragile state, without actually having cleared it with the markets, who actually make a difference. And the markets absolutely took fright, because they thought that the figures didn't add up. And that's when it all started unravelling. At another time, with more preparation, with better work and making sure that the figures balanced, a more ambitious agenda, which is all about growth, and it was all about bringing back tax, because tax is too high, might have been successful. It was badly timed, not properly thought through, and that was the real problem.
Is that the real explanation, or was the ideology bad?
Well, so the thing I'm really fascinated by is, as Liz's former speechwriter, I mean, I think we all really vividly remember Liz Truss's speech on the steps of Downing Street after her resignation. I don't know if you wrote that. I would imagine that you did. And I think everyone was struck, whatever part of the political spectrum they were on, by the lack of contrition. And I'm just genuinely very curious, if you don't mind me asking, whether there was a discussion about whether she should say sorry for people's mortgage rates soaring, whether there needed to be more contrition. What happened, what was the conversation like before she came out? So
the health warning I should give is that I've spent the last week in hospital, not for bad reasons, but because, and this may sound like I made it up, but I'm kidding you not, I basically had the birth of my first child, that sort of the day after she left. So it all kind of came thick and fast for me personally. Moving that aside, I was aware from afar, because basically colleagues of mine from fantastic officials worked with her on that speech. It was very much her, even the Seneca quote, that was her. And so I think it comes down to this belief that the ideas were right, the mission was right, growth is the thing we should all be wanting, and what the economy really needs. And so, yes, the tax cuts, clearly were the thing that tipped things over, but there still is the case for supply-side reform. I think it's too slow to build.
But the apology, I think, is what...
She really didn't feel sorry.
Well, I think it's that she's not one to wallow in these things. She'll be obviously, no doubt, sort of having her own sort of moments of recrimination afterwards. But the thing is, she'd already had to effectively admit that she hadn't succeeded in her mandate to the British people, live on national television. So I think that's was humiliation enough.
She was unrepentant. She is unrepentant if she's taking the message to America to persuade people. The fight goes on.
I think she'd believe that there still is the battle of ideas, and that needs to be fought.
Zara?
The real problem for me, obviously, wasn't the speed or the fact that the markets didn't like it. It was fundamentally the ideological argument that you can continue to increase the wealth of the very wealthiest while doing absolutely nothing for the poorest. And that ideology is widespread within the Tory party. And I think that's at the core of it. That's what my issue is with what the mini-budget did. Cost the public nearly £30 billion, has made life very hard for ordinary people, and it's ideological.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests today. Sorry, Tim. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you will be back tomorrow, but it'll be free, you twat. BBC Two lessons required. Anywho, the only word that you should take attention to or pay attention to in that entire fucking TV show is ideology. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Look it up in a dictionary. Fucking amazing. Like this. Yeah, I was screaming at my PC. The mind does truly boggle, especially after I've just did the whole rant before this fucking show happened. Wow, fucking wow. Zara for PM. It's pretty scary. £600 billion, and everyone's still skint. May I remind you, right, the Tory party voted against the minimum wage in 1997. Just let that sink in. Like slowly, very slowly. These fuckers literally, ideologically think the minimum wage was a bad idea. Just let that sink in before you listen to anything that any Tory says that comes out of their little squeamish fucking huddle rat faces. They voted against the minimum wage. All of them. All of them. I'll just leave it at that. The Tory party voted against the minimum wage. And you think these are